Hi, welcome to Art Salon. I'm Ellie Shore, and I've been hosting art salons for 10 years now. Just celebrated our 10th anniversary. I've been working with artists across South Florida to present art salons and spread the word that there are a great many exciting and very fascinating artists in this region doing significant work. Gretchen Scharnagl, our artist tonight, has dedicated herself to bringing attention to the environment here in Florida and around the globe. Heavily observational, based on scientific research, her work is meant to evoke discourse, create narratives, and concretize the storytelling of life on Earth, both dire and beautiful. Gretchen is a Miami-based artist and on the faculty of the Honors College at Florida International University. Her talk tonight is titled Materiality, Cannibalizing My Studio. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Gretchen Scharnagl.
Hello, I'm going to go ahead and screen share right off the bat. So in thinking about tonight and how I would even address my relationship to materiality and cannibalizing my own studio, I began to think about what things in my life began the journey. The journey of art ended and began when I entered FIU's art department because I immediately started using materials that are not found in an art store. But I was asked here tonight mainly because I now work in materiality from an eco-material point of view, more environmental. And so I'm going to start by telling you a story of me. And so I was thinking about what part of my childhood, where did it begin that I was a person who scavenged and salvaged and made things different from the things I found. And one of the memories that came to mind was I didn't have an affluent childhood. And so I got it into my head I wanted a chair in my elementary school years. I rode my handlebar banana seat bike down to the store and picked up about 5 melon or orange crates and rode home with just a saw and a hammer, disassembled all of the orange crates, reassembled them into a chair of which I painted blue because I found blue in the garage. And it was a very uncomfortable chair, but I remember being really proud of that chair that I fairly quickly outgrew and don't know what ended up happening to it. Throughout my schooling, I also scavenged for any materials for projects. That thing continued on to when I had children, and I would keep closets full of any kind of debris that could be made into projects. And the other thing from my childhood is I was very much a loner, and I spent hours and hours and hours befriending the neighborhood animals and laying in the backyard, observing nature for hours on end. If I have any friends in the audience, they will laugh at this, but I was silent for hours, and the wildlife got used to me. And so I got to observe a lot. I think I was an amateur naturalist of sorts. I never thought I would be an artist, nor did I even consider it really. The closest I came is when I wasn't doing as well in biology as I would have liked in my early years of college. I dropped out thinking that, well, first I tried a little graphic design, but this was pre-computer and that didn't work out. So I thought I could do some medical illustration or biological illustration, but it actually didn't go anywhere. So years later, I have small children. I'm almost 40. I don't go to art museums. I don't have any relationship to the art world. And I get it into my head that I have made a grave error in taking the wrong fork in the road. So I went back to college to finish this unfinished business of getting a degree, but pursuing art. Almost immediately, I gravitated to the non-colonized behaviors of artists throughout history. So not so connected to Western art, although I was born and raised in Western culture. But what things I found around me became part of my art. The earliest thing I remember using was dirt and glue, and sometimes the glue by itself, of which my professor called my snail trails. But so this continued on. So the reason I have a cat in the picture here is because my relationship to my pets has been very intense. In fact, the first art that I ever addressed as an art student was to create my own mythology that was heavily based on my relationship to my pets who had fulfilled what I felt like mythic roles. And I always had one cat at least, and the cats were end to end. And so I've had a few now that lived a full life. They have played such an integral part of my art making since I became an artist that my BFA show was predominantly mythological about my cats. This made me a great observer of cat body language, which bled over into an observer of nature, which was already the activity of my children and myself, which was to, go in the backyard and spend hours just communing with whatever was there. This cat is my current cat. And she also, so she's 7 years old. So she reflects basically my thinking of today by knowing what her name is. So this is Gaia. And so Gaia will start us on my journey through my art. So the thing that brought me here was Ellie saw these pieces, not here at Deering, but at the Frank. And these pieces, I had a lot of premeditation to what was going on with them. And they were unique to me in many, many ways. I had not been known to use color. Although I made large installation pieces, these were large for me in the drawing department. But what happened was Deering said to me, I like your migratory work, none of which I think I'm showing tonight. I had a large body of pieces that dealt with interrupted migrations and other things concerning birds and migrations. And so they said, we want you to have work in our ballroom, but we don't want you to have your interrupted migration pieces, make something new. And I decided I wanted to make it out of garbage if I could, but then there began to be so many rules and regulations about what could happen in this historic space that I ended up spending hours in this space, which brings me to the other thing about materiality, which is being aware of the space, not only the space of the subject that you are making art about, but the space that you are making art in and the space that the art is going to go to, which all play a role in our relationship to the art. And so I realized that this room had such a feeling about it that I had to create large pieces that were in saturated color. And so none of my trash that I had accumulated were saturated colors. So I ended up purchasing mulberry paper, hand dyed, because it was still sustainable, although it was not trash. And then I could not make pieces, these are 9x9 in my own studio. So each one of these pieces is actually 3 pieces put together at the moment of hanging. What you see in the 2 smaller pictures are works in progress. So you see the map and you see the stars, but you don't see the birds yet. In this particular case, I'll talk about the individuals when I get to them. So the first one is spring, and I wanted spring to be like the original one. And so the map I used to create the map was from the 1800s. And for each one of these pieces, my daughter helped me by making a diagram, and there would be a list of bird species. These bird species were culled from Deering's bird list and then run through by biologists I know and myself to determine which ones on the Deering bird list were actually migratory birds. I then found images of each bird that fit what I was trying to do with it. I looked up the size of the birds. I calculated their scale. I tried to recalculate how big that would mean the piece of paper is. That made them too big for my work. So they're all 50%, but all of these birds are in relationship to each other. At the very top, you can see the smallest one, the ruby-throated hummingbird, and the largest one is the white pelican. So this is spring migration. The fall migration was done after that one. And by this point, I had done a lot of birds. And so I was in a funny humor. And so kind of based on tree birds' comment about going south was easier because it was more like falling or going down. I decided that my migratory birds heading south would be more like falling or landing south. And so each one was re-looked up to find what these birds might look like that. And the original one, the one I just passed, was only nautical maps cut out. This one began to be any trash from my studio. So really a major cannibalization of what was in my studio. What you see down the bottom are some of the original birds cut out before they're glued on. And you see a random piece of art. And what that art is an art that had started out 3 fairly large pieces, 3 drawings. I had glued them all together and worked on them for months, put them to the side. And then by the time I was working on this piece, I realized that that piece had some textures and forms and colors I liked, but it wasn't going anywhere. So I kept cutting it up and cutting it up and cutting it up. You can see the big pelicans that made out of it, a lot of the birds. Anything with the blue and the brown pattern, you can probably start picking them out. But when I got to that one rectangle you see, I thought, oh, I kind of like that. So I've left that one for now. This third piece, I wanted to give a little homage to the birds that were not migratory, but this was a much more limited group. These were birds that were known to nest on the grounds of Deering. And so it's just nests. I didn't want the tree to be a classic picture of a tree. So this is basically a bunch of Florida live oak branches, drawn to just kind of burst out from the center. And I'm also showing that I actually am using a cutting mat and hand cutting every little piece, even when it's nesting material. And so this was a literal building of these nests with paper and debris. So then these pieces ended up at the Frank, and I subsequently was part of this ecosystems of expression, getting to talk about these pieces live, which also included, you see on the bottom, a small group of pictures, there's more than is in that picture, of what I call my Anthropocene series. The Anthropocene series is really, really what began a super conscious idea of eco-materialism. I had read the book, What's Next? Eco-materialism in Contemporary Art, and it had stakes so high that I fall short of fulfilling them. But it said, if nothing else, begin by becoming less of a consumer and use what you have. Then try to challenge yourself to keep using even the scraps of the scraps or reuse things. So I felt like I was already kind of in this mode. I had played with dirt and glue and started to reuse works. But this particular piece, some of you might recognize that it might look familiar to you because this has to do with another thing that influences my work. I tend to do my best work with a challenge. The previous stuff I was challenged with a historic space. This time I was asked to reference a Salvador Dali print that I could choose. I could choose which Salvador Dali print, but then just create my own art out of it. And I felt very uninspired and actually refused this call 2 times, but just like a hero's journey, on the 3rd time I did answer the call. So I decided that I would reinterpret some of his imagery into environmental issues, but also playing around with some of the games of the surrealist, which is images of things that may not be representing what you think they are, or maybe disturbing, or what does this all mean? It's also mixed media. But this piece actually predates those other colorful pieces. And this would be the first time I used colored pencil in a work. This is the first time I used watercolor. I had used gouache, but gouache is used extensively here. And I was not an oil painter. And the grapefruits and the cat, the eviscerated cat, are both oil paint on gesso on found graph paper. This found graph paper had been given to me by my father right before his death. And all the subsequent pieces are on this 70-year-old graph paper. So after that, I consciously at least glanced at Salvador Dali's work. So there's one with grapes in it. So that's about the only reference here, other than some of his horizon lines and things. This piece is, I didn't even talk about the environmental aspect of the other piece, but the other one was dealing with ocean acidity. This one is dealing with something which is also part of my found thing, my found subjects. You know, you go through life and you hear something and you think, how does that even happen? I heard that there was a sand shortage. There are sand pirates, and countries are having conflict because of sand. And I thought, you know, haven't they noticed there's some large deserts in the world? And turns out desert sand is no good for concrete, and I don't think it's very good for glass making. So they need ocean sand. And so out in the water there, you see a sand mining ship that's digging up the sand way, way offshore. But the way physics work is the sand that's onshore will level out the ground and go out there quickly and create a situation that we put concrete barriers on our shore. But eventually, even the sand under the concrete barriers will go away. You can see the consequence of the sea turtle and floating bags. Those shopping bags are one of the worst polluters because of how easily they're airborne. The two images you see are just works in progress. Third one, this one is dealing with seawall again, a uppity little mangrove that is growing on both sides of the seawall. But still there are coastal sewage tanks that are creating algae blooms and red tides, and that's not related to, but simultaneously we have coral bleaching. I'm trying to cover it up with the biblical fig leaf. The salt shakers are another situation where I cannibalized my own house. A friend of mine who in an emergency had to leave the country to his homeland right before he died. And he gave me a lot of his home things. And so a lot of my things in my house and my studio are things that I've inherited from friends. And this little salt shaker was the perfect little emblem of salt intrusion in the land with sea level rise. This one was a more generalized one, but I included the Salvador Dali in this case because this one, I pretty much just said, okay, Salvador, I'm just going to take one for one and do it. This one is all about ghost species, species that are extinct and endangered species that have to do with water. These butterfly species are all threatened or endangered Florida species. So this one has a lot to do with Florida, but although the calving ice, not, but the hurricane and the bridge in the Florida Keys, the key deer and the bent sign are all from our major Category 5 hurricane events down there. This piece is about time, mostly. And in this case, I was trying to really go very colorful. Again, I'm culling from my life. I actually have all these pocket watches inherited again, that none of them work. I thought that was very apropos, broken pocket watches. So I put them close to the time that they should, I didn't change their time, but I put them on the clock where they might land. That ribbon thing are superhighways in Florida and across the country. This is obviously a major global warming and weather event. But that lacy stuff is an endangered species, actually 5 different endangered species of lichen. During the pandemic, I kept going with this series and I started playing with other issues. So I had these scissors in my studio. I had this pale pinkish ribbon in my studio. And I made homemade ink out of copper and vinegar and homemade ink out of rusty nails and vinegar. This is obviously about COVID and a lot of the politics, but the environmental impacts all at the same time. That's a wet market in the background that doesn't show any animals, but shows all the crates and cages and boxes that they would have been kept in and transported, stacked just as they would be. In the drawers are all pangolins that are kind of obscure, whether they're sleeping or dead. The scissors and the pinkish ribbon is about cutting red tape, because the real red tape from Washington is actually a pink cotton ribbon. Second piece during the COVID lockdown was I was Zooming with my students. And so the computer I'm looking at right now is actually in the drawing. I'm sitting right next to the window that you see in the picture. And I saw all of these species of birds visit the pond that's right outside the window. My lemon tree created one lemon. And so this is just a little moment in how COVID affected our relationship with nature. I felt like I saw things through this window that I had never seen before. And there are some of my studio shots also. So all of these are mixed media. So all of these are using media, watercolor. So here's a major watercolor piece. I never used watercolor, even though I had inherited one set of watercolors and had been given two sets of watercolor, some of which were very beautiful sets of watercolor, but had never used them until I was challenged to use what was in my studio. Of course, I'm using watercolor on the worst paper you could possibly imagine here. This piece was kind of related to the other piece that had a lot of butterflies, because I wondered why people always gravitated to my pieces that included butterflies, like they're attracted to the beautiful thing. So in this case, every single one of these butterflies is on the red list, which is a list that has butterflies that are in some way, some concern, threatened, endangered, or actually extinct, one species of extinction. The ground is the microscopic image of this chemical you see in the photographs that's called caterpillar killer, that is sold as organic, but it's pretty nasty. And, caterpillars are baby butterflies. The tree is unrelated to the butterflies, other than I found it interesting that so many conifers are endangered that the red list has a category just for the conifers. And so this is a longleaf pine, a Florida species that's in danger. This is an older piece that was a different addressing of environmental issues. It had more to do with not using anything that would be permanent. This is graphite. It's not just graphite, but the two things that are in addition to the graphite are coffee and the house paint that the gallery had used to paint the wall before I got there. And so I was wanting to address one of my issues at the time was, again, issues of false love. I think that most or all of my work, like the work I love that I look at, has to do with personal things as well as environmental things. So the false love is you love a species so much you buy it as a pet, but it got ripped from the wild or is bred in captivity without concern of the environment, let go in the environment, and then we have to kill them. There's also included there the invasive apple snail, which is about twice the size of our native apple snail. These are two images of a now defunct piece. Here is the entire three walls of this piece that was called ephemeral mapping. Here's two more close-up images. As you can see, it is the Burmese python repeated again and again and again. It also has multiple species of invasive plants. It also has one 2K gecko. And on the next slide, you'll see that we had a performative event where people could come and they were invited to paint out first the pythons and all the invasive plant species and leave the animals that were inside the python, all the native species and the one domestic cat, to the very end. This guy in the middle on the bottom is actually Dr. Klein, the scientist who studies the invasive apple snails and who gave me all the information about them, he is about to paint over apple snail eggs there. So he helped to obliterate them. This is a piece that really has a lot to do with the found object. After my father died, I discovered he was a bit of a hoarder, and I have a kind of a lifetime supply now of strange little papers that probably are fairly old. This one had the price of 49 cents for a whole package of paper, so that probably dates it, but they're little, 6.5 inches. But I decided that since my upbringing was a little oppressive and personal voice was squashed, and so I decided to tap into Indian ledger art and just begin to draw on these little, not really ledger, but ledger-like papers, anything that came to mind. So some of them are environmental, some of them are very personal, some of them are mundane, some of them are close to the sacred. The ones you see are a bird that died hitting a window but fell to the ground on a piece of trash that acted as a pillow. The middle one is basically nearly a tracing of Bambi preliminary drawings, because throughout my life, people often have referenced Bambi lovers or kind of crazy things, but that movie not only was based on a book that was about the oppression of Jewish people in Europe prior to World War II, but it also depicts illegalities gone awry. So it's not as lighthearted as one would consider. I read a book called Omnivore's Dilemma that connected the fertilization and monoculture of corn and oil production. And so I have the oil refinery and the corn are feeding each other. Here's 3 more. One is that mundane, just funny thing, my goldfish ponds and my Doberman's feet in the pond, which didn't really happen, but I made it happen. The middle one is during the time of this making, the administration was getting rid of indigenous land, things that had been made national monument. One of them was called Bear's Ears. The map of Bear's Ears accurately is on the top. My image of a bear's ears being cut is on the bottom. What was cut is on the top. And the 2 little dotted maps are what was left after all the cutting away. I understand that the current administration has either stopped that procedure or done something to make it less of a catastrophe. The one on the right is plastic. I'm kind of obsessive on saving or cutting up any of those plastic things that come on 6 or 8 packs, which I don't get very much because I don't drink beer and I don't drink soda. I was asked to do a site-specific piece at Deering, and I was really excited because I thought about the wooded area. I thought about their historic buildings. And so I said, yes, I want to do that. They said, come over and we'll show you what your choices of site are. And they showed me one manicured lawn after another. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, what? And then I came up with this piece. So here is my proposal. And to Deering's credit, they took it like right away. And I was really thrilled with them because basically I'm saying, hey, what about, debris and its decomposition and fire and its importance to environmental things. And so I collected up branches that had been trimmed from my trees or neighborhood trees and trash, plywood usually, or any other trash wood. The trash wood was cut into shapes and then I torched them. Here's a picture of my studio of some that are not torched, so you can see leaf. So it's like debris things, some that have been torched, some of the debris. And then I wanted to include some spherical things because, they can be eggs, they can be mushrooms, they can be all sorts of things. But it turns out they were too light and they were going to blow away at Deering. So I filled some with concrete. You can see the 2 in the foreground on the left have concrete poured into paper mache. But then I bought a bunch of steel balls and did the rest on steel balls. And here they are dirtied outside so that they could be ready for this display, which I turned faster than I was ready to, but that's good. So here it is at Deering, my my leaf litter, my limbs, my fungal and lichen things that are supposed to be going through their natural processes. And I asked the deering, okay, I put this on this manicured lawn, but for the life of this piece, don't manicure my piece. So here it was after a few weeks. Notice that the paper is actually falling off some of the balls. It's really being lost. Here it is in its final moments. It has been completely engulfed. And I will tell you, because I had to take this down through that thick grass, that there was tons of wildlife in there. There's tons of things. Some of it like, wasp nests were on them. Two different types of wasp nests, actually a paper wasp nest and a mud dauber. There were all sorts of things going on. So I tried to salvage what I could. Most of it didn't survive. But this piece, which is the remnants of that piece, got to be displayed in Pinecrest Gardens. In one of my moments of realizing that I needed to cannibalize my studio, this piece was too big and I didn't have the storage. So I posted on Facebook, who wants it? And a friend of mine contacted me and sent a truck over. So that piece has a happy home and I don't know what it looks like now. But the steel balls had another life right away. I was asked to be in a show at the Kampong and I really didn't have anything, but I quickly dealt with the steel balls, like put gun blue on them. I rusted them. I put anything I could think of that would change the color, left them outside. So you can see them in their paper form. I took the paper off. I did this. And I had been making some refrigerator magnet passenger pigeons, a piece that really didn't go anywhere, but the little birds are on some of these globes. You can see a globe on the bottom that has never been displayed. It is covered in magnet passenger pigeons. And then as a gift to a friend, I created a do-it-yourself piece with my refrigerator magnets. This is an older piece, and this is my largest found object piece probably to date. It took me 2 Christmases to collect 550 Christmas tree trunks, of which some of my compatriots said to me, just go buy the leftovers from Christmas tree lots. But there is kind of a more metaphysical, spiritual, deeper meaning to all my work. And so it was very important to me that every single tree in my piece actually had served its life as a Christmas tree. This was basically based on my own sufferings with my hypocrisy of thinking myself an environmentalist, but making a million crimes against that idea. But one of the crimes was, I love my live Christmas tree. About 10 years after this piece, I found out that actually fresh Christmas trees are better for the environment than fake Christmas trees. Although a colleague of mine who every year pulls limbs out of his backyard and decorates them, and they're beautiful, puts me to shame still. But anyway, here's a close-up in one of the Christmas trees that my family and I denuded of their branches was an actual bird nest deep in the tree. Beautiful bird nest that was made out of mostly natural material, but quite a bit of man-made material too. It was so special that I drilled a hole into one of the largest of the Christmas tree trunks and created a reliquary. I had made reliquaries for years that I'm not showing here tonight, but that cross section between religion and science, or at least church and natural history museum, was part of my art. Here's another image of that work. That work was called Artificial Woods. Another earlier piece that has to do with materiality, but not cannibalizing my studio, are these birds, which are supposed to be killed passenger pigeons, which is an extinct species. Over 100 years ago, they went extinct. I did quite a bit of research. I created an art book about them. I have a little accompanying video that I believe I've lost digitally, but these, to say what I wanted to say about these birds, they are all made out of beautiful porcelain, but then they're made in such a way that the process, I made a mold, I pulled them out of the mold, let them rip, let them be deformed, threw them in the air. And then I used a Sager garbage fire with all sorts of debris from my yard, from my kitchen, other chemicals and minerals to colorize them. What you see to the right is a current piece that's not quite finished, where I'm using paper debris from my studio to create miniature of the same forest and using porcelain to make miniature of the same birds in a piece called After Duchamp, Gretchen's valise. Here is just another image of the passenger pigeon piece. It's about 350 of them, but some have been lost through the years, so it's probably down to about 300 now. This piece was a piece that was created because that python piece that was painted over was not only researched through some of the scientists who were working in the Everglades dealing with the python to get an accurate list of the animals that were eaten by the python, that they were doing their necropsies to find out. But these scientists and many others visited this show. It wasn't the first time I had a fair following of scientists, but it was one of the earlier, bigger ones. And they wanted me to donate all that I could of that python piece to the Everglades National Park. When I delivered my artwork to Everglades National Park, I saw these little boxes of the Florida tree snails, Lingus fasciitis or something like that. I forget the exact name. And I remember seeing them commonly as a child growing up here in South Florida. And I hadn't seen them for 50 years. And I said, "Are they extinct?" And they said, "No, but there's an interesting story about that. They were collected because of their beauty aggressively. And so much so that they were afraid that some of the most colorful were already extinct or about to become extinct. Each hammock in the Everglades had its own colorway. But absolute catastrophe happened when a do-gooder decided to collect all of them up and put them deep in the Everglades on all the same hammocks together. They hybridized, and with the hybridization, almost all of the really intense colored ones disappeared. And so the snail is common in the Everglades, but it is a lesser version of itself for people who like the color. And so I thought, oh my gosh, that's one of those things that's right under your radar. Not extinct, but the extinction of color. So since it was a quiet little subject, I created this. This is a very large drawing, pencil drawing in black and white. People don't like this drawing because of that. I also began to be interested in the idea that we were over-consuming and that even as a nation, we over-consume down our throats. And so what you see in the corner there is I made marzipan and royal icing, edible version of it, but no curator took the bite. And so the candy one doesn't exist anymore. I have shown this piece has only been shown in shows where I got to do the curation. It's a very unpopular piece. I don't know what that says about me. It's one of my favorites. But this is the next edible thing. And I have to thank Charo, who runs Edge Zones, because she was having a show, Food, Home, Love. And she asked me in, and basically I said, what do I have to do with that? What is my art? What do I have to do with that? You know, why are you asking me? And she says, oh, yes, come be part of the show. You know, just find something. And I had just seen, first of all, I love the documentary Wasteland. It's about Vic Muniz's piece that he did from making a piece out of recyclable garbage, I mean. And but then I found this little video on YouTube that was a tiny little documentary about the documentary person. And in her research to create this documentary about Vic Muniz, she had gotten permission to visit her local landfill and to be shown around and explained, you know, where our garbage goes. And I'm watching this, and I found it very fascinating. And the guy is out in California, and the guy's explaining, we put a layer of garbage, and then we put a layer of soil or whatever we put, and then we put a layer of garbage, and we put a layer of soil, and we put a layer of garbage, and we put a layer of soil. So it's kind of like a garbage layer cake. And so I was like, oh! And I said, Charo, I want to make an edible piece, but it will be fresh. So it has to be eaten on opening night. So you can't really sell it. Is that okay? And she said, yes, do it. One of my other criteria for anything I ever do edible is it's easy to make things non-toxic. But if it's made edible, I mean really edible. So whatever you think about this visually, it was delicious. And I have a few people I still know, including Charo, who could probably tell you, yeah, not just a little bit delicious, very delicious. It was a garbage layer cake made of all the ingredients you see listed at the bottom. And it was eaten at the end of the evening with a lot of gusto. Even a cockroach was on there, and that was really grotesque when somebody ate that. So then I have this piece that was kind of combining a lot of things. First of all, I did not do all the drawings you see. I invited anybody who wanted to participate in this to participate. But I said, this is my installation that you are collaborating with me. So temporarily, your pieces are my piece. But when the show is over, the individual pieces, if they don't sell or are dispersed, will be your piece. And even if they did sell, they were sold as individuals by the artist. And what this was is not just artists, these were anybody. So it happened to be a lot of biologists, quite a few students, fellow artists, and myself creating images of the lionfish. This was inspired by a lot of scientists being doom and gloom about lionfish were so pervasive now that there was nothing we could do to even reduce their population. And I thought, my gosh, we are so good at eliminating species. Give me a break. My passenger pigeon piece, that was, we eliminated the passenger pigeon in about 50 years from the most populated bird on Earth to gone. And so I thought, we can do this. And so I got a whole bunch of people together and created this piece. Each artist that was involved had to create two pieces. One was the lionfish, that is the picture you see. If their lionfish piece sold, it was replaced by a drawing they had done of a native species. And so we were going to try to create a performance piece of reclaiming the reef.
A South Florida artist is working to stop an invasive species from taking over our waterways. She's encouraging people to take the lionfish out of the ocean and put them on a plate. CBS 4's Maggie Newland explains.
Gliding through the water, the lionfish looks exotic, even elegant. But they are venomous, invasive, and destructive, and biologists say they're multiplying in South Florida waters.
They're just reproducing at an uncontrolled rate and eating everything they can.
You open the stomach of a lionfish, and there'll be like 4, 6 little fish in there, and they're often the babies of very important native species.
South Florida artist Gretchen Scharnagl became fascinated by the lionfish and created this exhibit at Pyramid Studios in Kendall. All of the artwork features the lionfish. Everything at this exhibit is designed to raise awareness about the lionfish, even this cake. They start small, like they might be in an aquarium. Then as the cake goes on, you can see there are native species, but also lionfish. By the final end of the cake, the entire thing is covered in lionfish.
Because there seemed to be a solution to the problem.
Why not eat the fish that eats everything?
They don't look edible, do they?
Really look poisonous.
Often we'll find people who say like, oh no, you can't eat them because they're like puffer fish and they're poisonous, but really they're venomous and all the toxin is confined to their spine.
Once the spine is removed, the lionfish can be filleted, fried, grilled, or cooked any way anyone likes it.
If everybody likes this, that they'll want other people to go out and catch lionfish so they can cook them up and enjoy it.
It's fantastic. I'd order this at a restaurant.
So maybe in the future, people will look at the lionfish and think dinner. Maggie Newland, CBS 4 News.
So I brought in some Biscayne Bay little biologists there who talked about lionfish. They brought a live lionfish. They dissected a lionfish. And we had some local fishermen and a guy from the Audubon donate 140 lionfish that we cooked up live behind the gallery. And it was a pretty good evening. And they ate the cake at the end of the evening. That was really, people really liked those, the native species better than the lionfish when it came to the cake. So here are some of my contributions to that piece. Here is one of my drawings of lionfish. And then the others are the native species that would have replaced them. But I brought these in, the lionfish are done in graphite, but the little ones on the top, a friend of mine, possibly making fun of me, said, "Oh, Gretchen, you like your alternative materials. So here's some squid ink I bought from the culinary store and use it in your art." So those three little ones on the top are squid ink, coffee, and white gouache. The one on the bottom, the macroalgae, is coffee and graphite. So this is a more personal piece that just has to do with finding your imagery and finding your subject around. This is a deviation, but also an example of how there is no separation between me, my personal life, my environmental issues, and everything else. You see the pythons in there, it's killing a deer. There is Ebola virus in here, and the chocolate cocoa pods that it is endangering the harvesting of. There are nests in this enlarged piece of it. The little grayish black, almost round pieces are because of who I am. Friends give me gifts like that is based on a friend of mine who brought back elk poop from Finland for me because she thought I would like it. And yes, I did. Those are grape stems. Grape stems are a piece of organic matter that after I eat my grapes, I'm always aware of. So I compost it, but often I take it out in my studio and draw it. It has become a universal symbol in all my art of the party's over after Dionysus has in it. You can see in the upper right-hand corner of the enlarged piece some blades, the X-Acto blades. My cat that I eviscerated and mummified is shown in this drawing. Some mold and mildew inside a building is shown in this drawing. A little tiny praying mantis that hatched in my daughter's apartment, unbeknownst to her, but she discovered it when her cat threatened the little praying mantis and it put its hands up in defense. And I thought, oh my gosh, if this little praying mantis can defend life like that with such bravado, I will include it in my drawing as a symbol of how we all should be. Anyway, this piece was shown one time and then immediately cannibalized into pieces. So it has no second life. It's been chopped up and dispersed. One of my other obsessions with trash is my coffee, which is my ritual every morning. I use recycled coffee filters, and then I save my used recycled coffee filters in my art all the time. And one of my earlier works, which was based on some years ago, I had played around in my graduate studio using two walls of my studio to map out my life in trash. You know, I had dust bunnies and all sorts of things. I don't have any good images of that. But one of the things I had done is I had started to pin coffee filters almost like specimens on the wall. When I say specimens, I mean, if you look closely at the picture on the right, you can see fairly long black pins. These are really high-end, made in Austria, butterfly pins or entomological pins are not really called butterfly pins, but the really large ones are often for butterflies. And so each coffee filter is pinned carefully to the wall with two entomological pins to transform them from merely the coffee filter out of the box, because that's how they go. They go like that and they end up like that. And I asked this museum, this is the Appleton Museum, and I asked them, could they please let any coffee that falls to the ground stay? And so the act of decomposition is kind of a performance piece. So I don't really do much performance, let's say me, my body, but I like when my work is performative, like it does things, or the audience is performative, they eat my cake. Another piece that came out of that, which is the concept of a large installation, but can fit in a small box, is this piece, which was done the year that was exactly 100 years after the extinction of passenger pigeons. And I thought I could laser cut them myself, but turns out laser cutters can't cut metal. So I contacted a metal worker, a metal shop that makes industrial things, and commissioned them to make 1,000 gradating from about 3 inches to a ½ inch little passenger pigeons that had very sharp beaks I could stick in the wall. Maybe the reason some people have never seen this is because if I have a curator say, yes, I want that in my show, I'm hoping they have somebody else have to stick all 1,000 birds on the wall for me, because or else that should be the performance. Anyway, so that's 1,000 stainless steel passenger pigeons. The idea of extinction vortex is about taking birds that are not birds, any species that is super plentiful, and taking it below the threshold of survival, that either their breeding habits or their behavior in some way, their culture, their animal culture has created in them something where if the numbers are reduced, they can't survive. And so that's what the name extinction vortex comes from. Shown in the same show as that extinction vortex, I was still working on some things that combined more personal issues with my ideas of materiality. So here I'm going more pure materiality as opposed to blatant environmental imagery. So this is all trash, rusted steel ties, pieces of wire that I used to collect, but then students would give it to me. They'd find it on the ground and think it was a big joke because I'd be very excited about found rusty wire. These are, old rusty X-Acto blades, because I always tell my students, if it's important, change your blade. So you end up with a lot of blades. I don't throw them away. But this was also based on my fascination with how far back art went. And most likely the earliest work was body art. I myself have no tattoos, scarification. I do have pierced ears. That's the limit of it. But I'm interested in all the reasons why we have done these things to the body that actually cause pain in the doing. And so many of them are healing. And so this piece and the entire show was called Wall Piercings. And it was treating the gallery as though it was the body, and the piercings of these non-figurative organic forms was simply a healing process. Here's some close-ups of them. I also included it, you don't see it in these two, but in this one in the corner, I had some remnants of gold threads, I think silver threads too. And since the two walls implied that there might be two beings in the room, or two sides to this story, I wanted the two stories connected with golden threads. And so there's a tangle of golden threads between them. That piece had a second showing, but it's never the same. So it becomes very site specific to wherever it goes. Here's the second wall, straight on. I think the X-Acto blades are beautiful. So I don't know what that means, but I love trash. I love the twisty little wires. Any of the little gnarly wires that you see coming out of the wall, absolutely were given to me by students mostly. I think predominantly sculpture students who would find them out, people carrying stuff and dropping things. But I ended up becoming so bloody and injured with the creation of this piece that I ended up having to get a little hand drill to pre-drill some little starter holes for myself. So this is a much more recent piece, right before the pandemic. And it is a piece that has a lot of cross sections. One of which is, I have begun to be so absolutely influenced by my readings. In fact, that a lot of the terms you've heard me use I can tell you exactly what book they came out of. I love to read science. I almost never read art. I almost never read nonfiction. But I'm also interested in relationships of the entirety of our history of our Earth, which means the entire history of us, which means that it is an equity of the human and the non-human, which bleeds into equity in all things, which bleeds into political issues, which bleeds into cultural issues, which bleeds into our day-to-day behavior. And so with that in mind, the dominant book that influenced this was a book called The Story of Earth, of which, I had some really intense experience. One of the first minerals, I think, were formed after the Big Bang, and was in the absolute creation of the Earth. was graphite. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know, it's almost spiritual to me. But these 6 earths, the author had divided the story of Earth into 6 colors. And he had his reasons for his 6 colors. And I took the information from the book and embellished the imagery and did further research to create the 6 earths. I could go off on a too long of a tangent on each one. So I'm just going to show these. The gray earth, which I did the most research about. The book would have talked about possibly the beginnings of life, but it was lipids and free-floating RNA, which create a membrane-like structure. And they think once you have a membrane-like structure, you have the first vehicle to have created life. And so they're not sure if you can say life is there, but the parts that are life. So that brings us to this idea that we are formed from rock. And in addition to everything else I could have told you from my childhood, I have rocks all over my house. It's likely for Mother's Day, my children will just give me a rock they found. You understand? I like rocks, and I don't need them to be like special rocks, rocks are so intensely part of the earth, and I really love that. The blue earth is, they pretty much have surmised that the earth at one point was either completely covered or nearly completely covered with water, but they don't know. Was it salt water? Was it fresh water? Was it somewhere in between? Was it something they don't know? And in my research, I decided that I would say it was salt water. And so I created this with every color of blue watercolor from all my sets of watercolor and salt. The other one is pretty much, I think, the same old thing, graphite and coffee. That you'll see that all the time. This is a picture of ancient bacteria fossil with red iron oxide. It is a fairly recent understanding that these shapes that you see to the right are formed by life. And they can date those red rocks now. So life began way, way, way earlier than they thought. And the reason is because the atmosphere did not have oxygen as its predominant ingredient. And so there was tons of iron. There was tons of iron in the water, they think. So the water could have been a different color, but it wouldn't have been red, because red is the rust, is iron meets oxygen. So the fact that we have these ancient oxidized iron rocks is evidence of life, because it's evidence of oxidation, which comes from photosynthesis. And so it's probably a bacteria that is photosynthesizing. So, kind of really lovely stuff for me. So here is the actual piece. The piece was an installation created in 3 parts. I'm treating it somewhat like it's a poem. So it's an elegy for Earth. The first one, if you were looking at the writing, the Earth on the other side was Earth Retold. The middle section here of these tracing paper, which I have a deep history with tracing paper, because I'm the youngest of 4 sisters. I have a younger brother, but the youngest of 4 sisters. And so they were off in the world when I was still quite young. And my one sister studied to be an architect. And so I was introduced to canary yellow tracing papers and other rolls of tracing paper early on. So that's been a material I've always used. And I feel like it is harking back to materiality, speaks of fragility, and is difficult to work with on that scale. I'm going to show you some close-ups. So here's a super close-up of the one that is called Peopled, and it's about Earth being populated. So you might recognize that those people look fairly consistent. Again, this is an inherited from my father's stuff. He had a lot of templates from when he studied engineering. And so that is a classic architect or engineer's template for people. And it's repeated, but then I am cutting them out so I can make a relief to make a rubbing. And I'm rubbing it with carbon paper. The carbon paper also was about 50-year-old carbon paper. Then harking back to the sand shortage idea, I use sandpaper to make rubbings with beeswax crayon because I didn't want to use a petroleum product because I was trying to stay away from that. That's about over erosion and the stories I already told you. I had a local scientist help me with acquiring a cross section of Florida from the ground layer down to the water table of our limestone, Florida limestone, which is our water filter, our aquifer, and the ground under our feet. So here I'm recreating it with a laser cutter so I can make rubbings of the photograph of the limestone. Then I'm making rubbings of plastic, petroleum-based commodity. Storm drains. Storm drains kept being something I was hearing about, particularly on Miami Beach, but also any coastal places. Water level rise is creating a situation where we think of storm drains are already a problem because in rains, pollutants can go down and they're going down to our aquifer. But now salt water with water level rise is coming up. So we're having this horrible mix of salt water, rainwater runoff, which includes pollutants, and that's done in graphite rubbings. I wanted to reference carbon cycles, carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, as I have written there. And these leaves, I went over, I'm searching my yard. I can't find those leaf skeletons. I wanted something that looked like decomposed leaves. Everybody's found those, when you find the beautiful leaf skeleton. And one of my daughters said to me, you go over to Fairchild, you'll find leaf skeletons. And so I can tell you that all of those leaves came from Fairchild, off the ground, mostly decomposed leaves, and are rubbings of that. In the same show, the third part that's called Earth Remains, which I am now in the process of redoing. I'm going to leave these two parts in it, but I'm making some new parts for the parts I'm not showing you. I wanted something that symbolized our disregard in what we are willing to use animals for. I'm pretty violently against trophy hunting. Something that's not trophy hunting, but it's close, is the finning of sharks for the status shark fin soup. This is not staving off starvation anywhere. It is simply a cultural status thing. And yet the sharks that are being slaughtered the fastest are the ones with the biggest fins. It's a horrendously disgusting process. I actually purchased a very accurate 3D model of 3 different sharks, the black-tipped reef shark, the Caribbean reef shark, and the blue shark, because all 3 are finned for their fins. And then with digital help, because anybody who knows me knows that I am very technology compromised, but I did my research how big the shark should be. Turns out it was kind of too big for what I was trying to do, so we reduced it slightly, but these would still be accurate adult size, just not the biggest ones. And we actually digitally cut the fins off almost exactly where they would be cut off by the people finning them. If I was a digital artist, that would have been the piece, because it was so emotionally disturbing to digitally cut digital sharks that I can't tell you. That was actually the piece. You guys are just seeing some kind of remnants of that piece. So anyway, so then it was 3D printed with plant-based plastic. I still don't even like using plant-based plastic, but I had to make it in parts, put the parts together, and then paper mache coffee filters to it. All the leaves you see on the wall are super endangered species of trees in the United States of America that are cut out of wood, laser cut out of wood, which is basically the hypocrisy of me and humans, my fellow humans, that I would actually make grossly endangered trees out of wood. They're covered with graphite. The ones on the right are just in the making. I kind of prefer them when they're still slightly wet from the glue. So I showed you that. This is just a play piece, and I could have shown you a lot. There's a lot of playing that goes on in my studio with my debris and cannibalization that doesn't always see the light of day. Sometimes the pieces are pieces when they're in pieces, but still I sacrifice them a second time into the next thing. So this is a piece that's never been shown. I just talked to the Coral Springs Museum of Art. So this piece will be in my show at the end of summer. and it is a performative piece. This piece I made out of only trash from my studio, which includes newspapers. At the time, there was some newspaper articles with like dozens and dozens of little people's faces. And since I really wanted to have people in this piece, you can see all the little people faces all came from one New York Times. But all the rest of it is other newspaper or magazines or trash that's in my studio. But this piece, and I don't even know if it'll ever matter, but I decided to create it based on the story of Earth. And so each layer is supposed to be looking similar to what it would have been. So the interior layers look like molten lava and basalt. And then it looks like graphite, and then earth, and then, greenery and other things on the surface of the earth. It is super heavy. So I used found things around my studio to create an interior piece of copper that I found in my studio to help with support all that hardware. It's an old 400-pound test fishing line I had used for my Christmas tree project. And on the side, you see some images that I will talk about in the next slide, but they are inside of this sphere, a sphere I consider Earth. So that's called Earth Pinata. This is not all of them, but if I were to show you all of them, there are 2,020 plastic toys bought, used, usually in lots, that could be broken, could be damaged. They had to be animals, plants, or fungi. And there's one mushroom, so fungi is represented. There is some Lego plastic plant pieces that suggest macroalgae and fungi. Some of them are very recognizable. But to create an equity of the toys, because the toys were very much, and it took time to get them all, because I wanted to make sure I had some plastic toys from the beginning of plastic toys. So I have some margarine toys from post-World War II in here. They're from the 1940s. I have toys from the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000, up to 2020. Every single decade is represented. What animals I got, what plants I got was what is out there. And so it was interesting to see how many were species that are now grossly in danger. There could actually be some rhino in the piece that are already extinct. Some of them were recognizable because they were later made toys, and it was written on the plastic in the mold. Some of the others, I had my two science daughters help me to see if we could identify. But let's say it was an elephant, and we could tell it was an elephant, but we couldn't tell which elephant. I would call it elephant. So I have a list of every single one here, but there are, Sumatran rhino, things that are specific like that. A lot of the sharks and whales, the name was right on there. There were also moments where I'm hit with part of this idea of reuse or bricolage, because some of them had been so obviously played with. One of my favorite childhood books is The Velveteen Rabbit. So the worn down ones, the broken leg ones, or the few that had a child's handwriting written their name on it, were kind of the most valuable to me. But in trying to make the cheapest one to the most, extravagant one have an equity, I painted them all black. And I found out that some of the ones that looked cheapo, once they were painted black, the original artisan was actually quite good. So if this piece breaks, part of this piece is I couldn't test it. So it's got 2020 plastic animals inside, and it's got a lot of thick layers, enough to carry that close to 50 pounds of plastic toys. And so when the Pinata event happens, here's what we will not know until it happens. We will not know, is the earth tougher than we think? Are we going to bat and bat and bat that Pinata and it looks batted, but nothing happens? Are we going to bat it once and it breaks and spills all the life of Earth out onto the ground? At any rate, that's what will happen next with this piece. That piece pretty much set me on a thing of wanting to make Earth. So when Coral Springs contacted me to have a show, they showed me the space. It's a huge space, and they said, make whatever you want. And I realized that all of my specificity in all my work had boiled down to just two things. One was use only the stuff I have. And the other thing was, it's really the whole Earth. It really is Gaia, like the cat. And so I have made 20 Earths. I did not want them to become political. I didn't want to time them. Are they, a few million years old Earth? Are they now? Are they a few million years in the future? So I didn't even want the land masses. I wanted to be, let's say, like chance patterns. So you see me making them on the one side. Even the meridian is only found wood, and they're not finished. They're in progress right now. Here are the steel balls that I made, all the small ones. I made them exactly like globes were made. I found this film from the 1950s that showed to paper the ball, then it's cut off, and then it's put back on. And so I can make them again. This piece to store the workings of the piece hopefully will become a piece in the show also. There's a bulletin board in my studio. Here is the debris of my studio, but taken at different times. So you can see there's my after Duchamp, Gretchen's valise. That's the actual valise. There I'm working on some of the trees with my pile of trash. Here are my boxes of trash. Here's one of my obsessions is old used fishing line. Here's my pile of old nautical charts. There's one of my steel balls that isn't on the wall. There's an old dictionary. I have a collection of National Geographics that is solid all the way through the 1940s, has quite a few through the 1930s, and I would never use them in my art. All of those National Geographics are redundant to my collection of National Geographics. So, and see that big box? That big box is housing the Earth Pinata. Okay, just in the last few weeks, my husband, who is a contractor, had this job where he had a stack of plywood that was about as tall as me. He had to cut a bunch of geometric shapes out of. And then when he was done, there was this pile of leftovers. Actually, it was bigger than this. I took this after I was already claiming it and using it. But I told him I have to make a piece. So without having planned to interrupt my globe making with this piece, I have begun to make the pieces that you see on the side. They most likely will end up having fire be a component also. And I don't know how I'm doing on time, but this is kind of wrapping us up. This piece is very much related to the other large pieces I began with, the 9-foot by 9-foot collages, paper collages, except in this case, the mulberry paper is only left over from the other ones, and everything in here was left over. So I actually have another piece of my own artwork from many years ago, the birds and the heart and the hands and the human figure and the butterfly and, and the cats. Those are all about 3 different works of art cannibalized. I actually cannibalized some student work that they never picked up. So I don't know if you can see right under that bird, under the earth, there's what looks like somebody's eyeglasses. I doubt if he's in the audience, but my student, Matt, I'm sorry I used your piece after whatever it was, 10 or 15 years, I haven't seen you. So all the rest of that you might recognize. If you look closely, you will almost recognize every piece that I have shown you, because that is the tracing papers, the working drawings, the dictionary pages, some of the mapping, the cat that is up in the sun. I don't know if you can see it, it's whitish. That cat was the tracing drawing I made to go into the python piece because I wanted one domestic animal in there. And that's it. I think the show is going to be called Terra Ephemera, and opening night is September 22nd, 2002. Thank you to Ellie Shore and And those are my Dobermans. And that's a really old piece I didn't talk about. Oh, on the right is one of my globes. Okay, but that's it. I'm done.
Okay, Gretchen, that was an amazing presentation.
Thank
I
you.
was just, I personally was just spellbound. I was leaning into the computer and looking at the details and putting it all, trying to put it all together. There's so much and so many ideas packed in. I couldn't be happier. Good night, everyone. See you in October.